The sun had barely risen when Moses woke, though he wasn't sure he had slept at all. The night had carried a restless weight, each breath reminding him of what awaited him at dawn. He lay still for a moment, listening to the quiet inside the small dwelling where he and Aaron had rested. Outside, the first sounds of Egypt, moving into another day, drifted through the air. Stones shifting, wheels grinding, voices already weary before work even began. The rhythm of oppression repeating itself. Moses rose, tightening the belt around his tunic and pulling his cloak over his shoulders. He touched the staff leaning beside him, a simple piece of wood, yet no longer ordinary. It still felt alive with the memory of Horeb, carrying the imprint of a presence that had claimed him fully. Aaron stood near the doorway, watching his brother with a look that blended support and unspoken concern. They both knew what today meant. They would walk into Pharaoh's presence, carrying a message that could ignite the entire land. The presence he had encountered at Horeb seemed to rise again within him, and Moses heard the words that had shaped his calling from the beginning. Go to Pharaoh. Speak all that I command you. I will bring my people out with a mighty hand. As they stepped out into the morning light, the settlement stirred around them. Women gathered water in clay jars. Children rubbed sleep from their eyes. Men moved toward their labor posts, with shoulders already sagging under invisible weight. Some glanced at Moses and Aaron, their expressions a mix of fragile hope and quiet skepticism. Rumors had spread through the night, whispers that the God of their fathers had risen again, that he had seen, heard, and now acted. But centuries of bondage had taught them to be cautious with belief. Aaron led the way toward the palace road, a path Moses had not walked in decades. The city rose around them with its familiar architecture, massive pillars carved with images of gods and kings, walls polished to reflect sunlight, statues looming over streets designed to remind every passerby who held power. Moses felt the past pressing against him from every angle. He remembered walking these streets in different clothing, under different circumstances, carrying the education and confidence of royalty. Now he returned not as a prince, not as a fugitive, but as a messenger whose authority came from something no empire could contain. The closer they drew to the palace, the thicker the air felt, not in heat, but in expectation. Egyptian guards lined the entrance, their posture rigid, eyes scanning with a mixture of boredom and suspicion. Moses and Aaron were permitted inside after Aaron spoke the name of the God who had sent them, not because the guards respected it, but because Pharaoh enjoyed hearing boldness from those who had no earthly reason to be bold. They entered through tall doors carved with images of gods watching from every angle. The hall stretched wide, columns painted with deep colors that caught the rising sun. At the far end, Pharaoh sat elevated on his throne, the striped nennies framing his face, his expression controlled and measured. He looked like a man who believed himself the center of the world, as immovable as the stone seat beneath him. Servants stood in rows, silent. Incense drifted through the air in thin trails, mingling with the cold confidence of royalty. Moses stopped far enough to show respect, but close enough to be heard clearly. The air tightened. Aaron stood beside him, steadying the moment with his presence. Moses felt again the weight of the bush at Horeb, the fire that had promised to go with him, the voice that had spoken existence into his bones. Moses spoke the words God had given him. Let my people go, that they may worship me in the wilderness. He spoke with the calm certainty the flame had placed in him, declaring the message given to him on holy ground. The command was simple, yet carried the weight of heaven behind it. It moved through the hall with a stillness that seemed to challenge every carved god on the walls. Moses saw the flicker of annoyance cross Pharaoh's face, an expression of disbelief that anyone would approach him with a directive instead of a request. Pharaoh did not rise, did not soften. He examined Moses with narrowed eyes, as though trying to recall the younger man who once walked his halls wearing the garments of royalty. What he saw now did not impress him. Moses had the look of a shepherd, not a threat. Pharaoh's pride allowed no room for the idea that a god outside his pantheon could speak with authority equal to or greater than his own. His reaction came not in anger at first, but in cold contempt. He dismissed the command as delusion, insisting that the God Moses spoke for held no power in Egypt. Then his contempt sharpened into cruelty. He tightened the burden on the Hebrews, increasing their labor while withholding the materials needed to complete it. He turned the request for freedom into the justification for further suffering. In his mind, if these people had enough energy to dream of worship and freedom, then they had enough strength to be worked harder. Moses and Aaron left the palace carrying the weight of that decision like sand sinking into their chests. The city felt heavier now, shadows longer, voices sharper. Hebrew overseers confronted them almost immediately, faces twisted with grief and frustration. They accused Moses of worsening their suffering, of giving Pharaoh a reason to tighten his fist. Moses absorbed their anger without resisting it. Their pain was real. Their fear was real. And in this moment, he felt the sting of being the one who stirred wounds that had never healed. That night, Moses walked alone outside the settlement, beneath a sky spread wide with ancient stars. The desert breeze carried a chill, brushing against his face as he lifted his thoughts toward the one who had sent him. He opened his heart fully, not hiding his confusion, not concealing the ache rising within him. He spoke into the quiet, longing to understand why obedience had been met with increased pain for the people he came to help. And in the quiet, the answer came, not in fire this time, but in a voice steady and certain. Pharaoh's heart is hard, but I will stretch out my hand. You will see what I will do. The presence came again, not as fire, but as a depth moving through the night. Moses felt assurance settle across him, like a mantle he did not yet feel worthy to wear. The path would not unfold quickly. Freedom would not burst forth in a single moment. Pharaoh's hardened heart was not a barrier, but a stage. Each resistance would reveal power that no kingdom could claim as its own. Each refusal would draw a sharper contrast between oppression and deliverance. Moses felt the truth seep into the cracks of his fear and steady his resolve. He returned to the camp in silence, carrying not answers, but a renewed sense of direction. The next days stretched with tense expectation. Moses and Aaron would stand again before Pharaoh, and again he would refuse. But each refusal would open the way for signs that echoed the same fire Moses had seen on Horeb, power moving through creation, bending nature, revealing a truth that could not be ignored. The confrontation between heaven and empire had begun, and Egypt was about to learn who truly held authority. The days that followed moved with a heavy tension, as if the air itself sensed a shift forming beneath the surface of Egypt. Moses and Aaron returned to Pharaoh again, not with different words, not with different posture, but carrying the same steady certainty. Pharaoh's hall felt colder this time, the carved gods staring from the walls as though carved in defiance. Pharaoh listened with the same hardened stare, a gaze that refused to register possibility. His refusal was not merely an answer. It was a declaration of ownership. In his mind, the Hebrews belonged to him. Their breath, their labor, even their hope existed to serve the architecture of his power. The first sign touched the Nile. Moses stood at its edge, the water flowing with its familiar calm, the river that gave life to Egypt in every season. He remembered being drawn from this very river as a child, his small body lifted out of danger into a destiny he could not have understood then. Now he returned to its banks, carrying a message that would turn the river itself into a witness. As the staff moved with quiet purpose, the water shifted. Moses remembered the words spoken to him before he lifted the staff. By this you will know that I am the Lord. The surface of the Nile darkened, its movements slowed, as if a color that did not belong seeped from the depths upward. The river reddened until it no longer reflected sunlight, but carried the deep tone of blood, thick and unnatural. Fish floated lifeless to the surface. The smell rose heavy and sharp. Channels and storage pools turned the same deep color. The shock rippled through the land, unsettling those who depended on the river for everything. Yet Pharaoh remained unmoved. He turned away with a cold certainty, convinced he could interpret this sign through his own framework of power. His heart remained closed, not because he could not see, but because he refused to let meaning sink deeper than his pride. The days stretched in growing discomfort. Egyptians dug desperately for clean water, but the river offered none. The disruption to daily life was immense, but Pharaoh clung to control as though acknowledging a higher power would fracture the very throne he sat upon. Then came the frogs. They rose from the river in waves, filling every corner of the land. Houses, streets, kitchens, even the halls of the palace felt their movement. The creatures layered across surfaces, their calls echoing through the night with unnerving persistence. Egypt churned with irritation and fatigue as people tried to remove them only to find more appearing again. The land felt overtaken, not by danger, but by relentless disruption. When the frogs died, the air filled with another heaviness. Still Pharaoh held firm. Next, the dust of the earth shifted. What had always felt lifeless and predictable now stirred with movement. The ground loosened as though waking from sleep, and tiny creatures rose like a swarm, breathed out from the soil itself. They covered skin, clothing, and animals, clinging in a way that carried discomfort into the most ordinary moments. Gnats moved in clouds that blurred vision and frayed the last threads of patience across the land. Yet even this, a sign drawn from the very earth Egypt believed it understood, did not soften Pharaoh's stance. The refusals became a rhythm of their own. A heaviness settled into the days, a sense that something larger than the conflicts of men was unfolding. Moses felt it every time he stood at the edge of Pharaoh's presence. The man before him still believed he controlled the narrative, still believed his throne anchored him to invincible ground. But Moses knew differently. Every refusal carved out empty space that the presence of the burning bush would soon fill. Each moment of defiance shaped the path for what came next. Then the air changed again. Moses heard the Lord speak with unmistakable clarity. "I will set a distinction between my people and yours. You will see that I am the Lord in the midst of the land, not with dust this time, not with heat, but with movement that sounded like the sky gathering momentum." Flies filled the land in spreading waves, thickening the space between sunlight and soil. They entered homes, markets, and courtyards, driving people to restless frustration. Yet there was a distinction. The swarms spared Goshen. The land where the Hebrews lived remained untouched, as if marked by an unseen hand. This separation moved through the minds of the Egyptians and Hebrews alike, unsettling assumptions, stirring questions, revealing a boundary they could not explain. Pharaoh's resolve shifted slightly, but not enough to release control. He wavered just long enough to consider compromise, then hardened again, tightening his grip as though any concession would unravel the fibers of his authority. Moses watched this cycle repeat, softening, hardening, softening, hardening, like a heartbeat out of rhythm with truth. Livestock fell next. Across the fields, animals weakened and collapsed, one after another, strength draining as though the land itself withdrew its sustaining power. Cattle, horses, donkeys, sheep, creatures that had shaped Egypt's wealth and daily life, grew still. The loss cut deep, sending ripples through an economy built on the backs of both man and beast. Yet again, Goshen remained untouched. It was as if creation drew a clear line between oppression and promise. Still Pharaoh resisted. Then came the boils. A heat spread across skin, forming painful blisters that marked bodies with visible suffering. Egyptians covered their arms and faces, moving with careful steps to avoid brushing against their own wounds. Even priests, men who served in rituals of purity, found themselves unable to stand before Pharaoh because of the pain marking their skin. Yet Pharaoh sat unmoved on his throne, his heart shielded behind a barrier that no physical suffering could break. The next sign rose from the sky. Before the storm broke, Moses heard the Lord speak again, his voice cutting through the tension in the air. "I could have wiped you out, but I have raised you up to show you my power." Clouds gathered in ways Egypt did not recognize. Thunder rolled with a depth that vibrated through stone structures and across the ground. Lightning cracked in bright lines that burned into the earth. Hail fell, heavy and destructive, crushing crops and breaking branches. Fields that once promised abundance now lay flattened. Yet again, Goshen stood untouched, its fields standing as quiet testimony that the one shaping these events did not wield power carelessly. Some of Pharaoh's officials began to fear, not out of faith, but out of instinct. They moved their livestock and servants under shelter when further warnings came. Others ignored the signs, and the storm took what they left unprotected. Egypt was shifting, hearts were stirring, but Pharaoh remained locked within a pattern he could not see, pride feeding stubbornness, stubbornness feeding blindness. Then came the locusts. They arrived like a moving shadow along the horizon. Wings filled the air in dense patterns that darkened the sunlight. The swarm descended on what remained of Egypt's crops, consuming everything green. Fields that had survived hail now vanished under the relentless hunger of countless insects. Trees stood stripped, their branches stark against the sky. Pharaoh's advisors pleaded with him, urging him to see reason. Even they sensed the shape of a greater power pressing against their land. For a moment, Pharaoh wavered, but once relief came, his heart sealed itself again. Then the light faded. In that heavy silence, Moses sensed the Lord speak again, the words settling into him with unmistakable clarity. "Stretch out your hand toward the sky. That darkness may fall over the land, not gradually, not as evening, not as the shifting of clouds." A weight fell over the land, a darkness so thick it felt tangible, a darkness that swallowed sight and erased distance. People reached out with their hands and touched nothing but shadow. They could not move easily. They sat still, breath shallow, wrapped in a night that offered no stars, no horizon, no direction. It lasted 3 days, long enough to dissolve confidence and unravel certainty. Yet in the dwellings of the Hebrews, light remained, warm and steady. Moses felt the gravity of each sign. They were not random disruptions. They were precise strokes revealing a story deeper than oppression and power. Pharaoh saw them as challenges to his rule. Moses saw them as revelations of a presence moving with intention through land, sky, water, and earth. Egypt was being stripped of its illusions, and Pharaoh was running out of places to hide from the truth tightening around him like the last threads of his throne. The darkness lifted as suddenly as it had fallen, leaving Egypt disoriented beneath the returning light. People stepped cautiously out of their homes, blinking against the brightness, unsure whether to trust the day that greeted them. The land felt changed, drained of confidence, as if every sign had pulled back a layer of certainty Egypt once wrapped itself in. The quiet that followed carried the weight of something unresolved. A calm stretched thin across a nation that no longer understood its own strength. Moses stood at the edge of the Hebrew settlement, watching the sun rise over a country stripped of its illusions. The previous signs had not been random. Each one touched the pillar Egypt leaned on, the river that fed them, the land that sustained them, the animals that carried them, the gods they prayed to, even the light they trusted to separate day from night. Everything familiar had been shaken, yet Pharaoh's heart held the same rigid resistance, as though he feared the collapse of his identity more than the collapse of his kingdom. Moses felt a heaviness settle into him, not as discouragement, but as sober recognition. The path was nearing a threshold. He sensed it in the stillness of the morning. In the way, the wind moved lightly across the ground, as if even the desert waited. The presence that had spoken to him from the burning bush felt close, not in fire this time, but in a quiet depth that steadied his breath. This story was not about signs alone. It was about a transformation that went deeper than Pharaoh's throne, deeper than Egypt's wounds, deeper than Israel's fear. The final step was approaching, a moment that would shift the destiny of nations. And Moses felt the weight of a new word settling over him. I will bring one more sign upon Egypt. After that, he will let you go. He walked with Aaron through the Hebrew quarters, passing families who had lived too long between hope and hardship. Their faces carried exhaustion, yet something else now lingered behind their eyes. An awakening shaped by the signs that had spared their land each time chaos struck Egypt. Children followed Moses with cautious curiosity. Elders watched him with a mixture of reverence and trembling anticipation, as if they sensed that the one Moses carried in his steps was preparing to move again. As the day stretched forward, word spread that Moses and Aaron were walking once more toward the palace. People gathered in doorways, following the movement with their gaze until the two figures became distant shapes on the road to the throne that had refused to bend. Moses felt no triumph in this moment, only purpose. The staff in his hand was steady, its weight familiar, its calling unchanged. Every step felt like the unfolding of a promise older than anything Egypt had built. The palace stood silent as they approached, its walls washed in sunlight that did nothing to warm the coldness inside its halls. Pharaoh waited, surrounded by symbols of a power he believed unshakable. Moses stood before him not as a challenger, but as a witness. The presence of the burning bush felt near enough to touch, anchoring him as he delivered the message he had been entrusted with. Pharaoh's heart hardened again, sealing the path ahead with final resistance. Moses turned away from the throne, the air shifting as he walked toward the city gates. He knew that what came next would reach deeper than any sign before. It would touch every household, every lineage, every future. The story was moving toward a night that would echo through generations. Behind him, the palace swallowed its own pride. Before him, Israel waited in breathless anticipation. The final sign was approaching, carrying both judgment and deliverance. And the God who burned in a bush was about to write a night the world would never forget.